We're here this morning. Thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing part of your Easter day and morning with us. I hope you've already had a good morning. For those of you who have had children, my little grandson is here. I didn't get to see him this morning yet, but I'm going to spend some time later today. And he's not even paying attention to me back there. I'll probably put him to sleep by the time I'm done. But I'm not going to be long. As we come and the church does Easter, this is truly like, it's hard to engage all of Christ's life. But this certainly is like the greatest event of all time. Done by the greatest human of all time, the goat, as I want to talk about it. But I think one thing is actually pretty confusing about Easter is we are here to celebrate the greatest of all time. We are here to celebrate what we call Easter, and Easter in a way, Easter's harder to tame than Christmas because everybody can be born, but not everybody rises again. And so we have this event. We have our God who is raised from the dead. And what seems so conflicting to me over the years as we've done Easter here at Nature Coast and we engaged Easter, and I was talking a little bit about this with Allie this morning, is we are here to celebrate the greatest human God of all time and all eternity. And yet somehow Easter morning, we've got to make our church the goat, right? We're the greatest church of all time. We have the greatest children's programs of all time. I've got to preach the greatest sermon of all time. I've got to do this. And we actually turn Easter, religiously speaking, into the church, into this thing where we have to be the greatest. And we have to do things. I've got to hit a home run with my sermon. I hope the kids in there are having a home run of a time. We get more interested. I'm just having a little in-house. If you don't come to church very often, or you might be here, or you might be thinking about coming back to church or whatever. We think more about how we can be great on Easter than we think about making him great. And I think we get in the way of Easter morning and Easter and what we are here to do that. I mean, and some of that is because of who we think God is. I do know that someone is live right now, and I can hear myself. Okay. I hear myself a few seconds behind. Oh, it's my wife. Oh. You think she hears enough of me at home. Anyway, so we're here, and really, I'm just here. I also think we make it. The Easter story is beautiful. It's complex. It's told all by all four of the Gospels. They all have different accounts. But the reality here this morning is that Jesus rose again from the dead. Our God came, he lived, and he died, and he rose again from the dead. That is Resurrection Sunday. That is Easter. And that is, as I will proclaim, I'm just going to proclaim that. I'm not going to defend that. We're going to read one of the gospel accounts of it. And I think sometimes we mix Easter up because of who God is. I think as at least the four gospel writers, each of them tells the story of the resurrection and their experience and how they experienced it. But we get into this mode. I mean, even in the way we kind of try to take over Easter as ourselves or as a church, because we actually we embrace this God who that maybe he's just going to give Nature Coast a gold star today. because we did such a good job. I think that all confuses us. And so I've been reminded as we've done Easter this year, and then, we're all nice and shiny and all of those things. Sometimes we engage Easter service and we come as if the resurrection never needed to happen. We come all shiny. We come all put together. And if we're actually all shiny and put together, none of which any of these people are in the story, then we actually don't need to be resurrection. We don't need resurrection. But I have a feeling I need resurrection today. And I'm going to share it as if I at least need the resurrection to be true, and maybe you too. So I'm going to read. This is the St. John's account of the resurrection. Early on the first day of the week, and I'm just going to read right through it, and then I might be a little bit all over the place as I talk about it. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one that Jesus loved. That would be John who's writing this. I mean, he always interjects himself into this story too. But they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. So Peter and the other disciples started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple, that's John, he wants you to know he outran Peter. Outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He'd been over. This actually, the resurrection has a lot of humor in it, the story. Then looked in, and the strips of cloth were lying there, but they didn't go in. Then Simon Peter came along and behind him and went straight into the tomb, and he saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. And the cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. And finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, again, also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had risen from the dead. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying, like nothing had really happened. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated there, where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. And they asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "Well, they've taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they put him." At this, she turned around and she saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't recognize Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it that you're looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him, and I won't tell your boss." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." And she turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." And Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. You can go back to the first slide. This is John's account of the resurrection. This is the actual story. I want to sit for a moment in the actual story. This story, as given to us by John, happened in the dark. While it was still dark, they went to the tomb. This story, as we've already read with Mary, the resurrection came in the dark. The resurrection came amongst tears, Mary's crying, and the resurrection came amongst confusion. It's the actual story of the resurrection. It came with tears. It came in the midst of tears. It came in the midst of darkness. It came in the midst of confusion. It came in the midst of a lot of unbelief. And I want to, at least for the next briefly few moments, say that's our story, right? That's each of our stories. There are stories, there's all kinds of stories represented in this room today. There are stories, some of you are here this morning, and you've been sitting in the dark a lot. The darkness of your story, the darkness of your own life, a darkness that you don't know where to take the next step, a darkness of a relationship that's not working out the way you wanted it to work out, a darkness of your children not responding to you in the way you want. Maybe you've received a diagnosis recently and you're sitting in that. You're sitting in that darkness. Maybe you're here this morning and you're battling an addiction, and like you've tried and you just keep going back and back, and you wonder if it'll ever end. You wonder if you'll ever do it, and you want to get up, and you're in the dark. That darkness at times lead people to tears. Tears have been shed this week in this room. Tears from all of those things, from diagnoses, from broken relationships, from life just not being what you wanted it to be, your story not being what you wanted to be. I know for a fact there's lots of confusion in this room. You may be even confused why you're here this morning and how you ended up here. You may be confused about the story that I just read. You may not recognize it. You may not believe it. There's unbelief in this room. And as I was even thinking about that and all the unbelief of the actual story of all of these characters, these are Jesus' disciples and Jesus' friends, and they have unbelief about what they are experiencing. And so we engage and we have this unbelief, which is always, it just shows the grip death has on us. We can't imagine a world where there isn't death. It so binds us, it so bound them, that to even entertain that Jesus had resurrected from the dead, of which he had told them he would, it's not even on their radar. That's how much death grips us and where we live. And so we live these lives on roller coasters. That's our actual story. Our life is a roller coaster. I went to Philadelphia a few weeks ago. I was up there at the end of March, and I actually from Ohio, and at least in my recollection, and I know it's been a while since I've lived in Ohio, that at March 30th, it should be a lot warmer up north, and I went to Philadelphia, and I get up there, and I didn't prepare. It was in the 20s, and I guess they told me up there would have been in the 60s, almost 70, a few days earlier. And you have that roller coaster, and it reminded me, living up there, is winter over? Is it safe to come out now? I woke up this morning, I actually have a friend in Buffalo, and he posted pictures of a complete snowfall this morning, Easter morning, April 17th. We all wonder that. Our lives are roller coasters. Our seasons roller coaster with our lives. We wonder, we've tried to come out. We live in these relationships, and we think everything is going well, and then we start to poke our vulnerability out and say, is it safe now? And then boom, we get hit. And the blizzard comes, and we crawl back in, and we think our health is going okay, and then it's not. We live this life on this roller coaster, and we just want life to be okay. And this is the beauty of each of the gospel stories, each of the 4 stories. We just have one of them I'm going to read here. What I want to say is our story and your story this morning is not so much different than this story. Mary, she's the first to the tomb. And the stone's been rolled away. She finds it empty. And it never dawns on Mary, in this episode, to say, oh, I remember. Jesus told me this was going to happen. It doesn't ever dawn on her. She thinks someone has actually stolen the body. She went expecting death. She even has signs that death isn't there, but she still thinks death is. So she runs and She tells the disciples, like, someone's like taken the body of Jesus. Yeah. And off the disciples run. And they get there. And the evidence is before them, and it even says that they did not believe in the resurrection. There's the other part of this human story is and this version didn't capture it, but the reality is when Peter and John looked at the tombs, the linen clothes that Jesus had been buried in had been wrapped. And were set neatly there. They were wrapped and set neatly there. And you think, if they think it's a grave robber, these were very tidy grave robbers. They took the body, and then they folded the stuff up, and they left it there. And we know from other things, they were like Roman centurions guarding the tomb. And yet in the midst of all of this, none of it should be making sense in their mind, and actually should make a little bit more sense, because Jesus had over and over again had said, this would happen. I'm going to die, and then I'm going to come back. And Mary and the disciples, it's like their only assumption is that the body has been taken. They're confused. They're not listening to Jesus. It's interesting, because I even think when we read Jesus' account earlier in the Gospels where he says he's going to be raised from the dead, we think Jesus is making a prediction about what will happen. And this is a subtle point, but it's an important point. When Jesus said that he was going to die, be buried, and raise again the third day, he wasn't just making a prediction, he was making a promise, and he does not lie. They viewed it as a prediction, they didn't see it as a promise. So it did not resonate with them. And then finally, of all the people, Mary just keeps repeating the story. So then she runs into Jesus. She thinks he's the gardener. And what does she say to the gardener? Like, look, if you've taken his body away, I won't tell anyone. I need to know. She stays in her unbelief. She stays, as it were, in the grip of death itself. So what's comforting about this story for you and I who are here this morning? They didn't recognize Jesus. They didn't understand what was going on. Even when their eyes were presented something, they were somewhat obstinate in their relationship or their view of what was going on. And that's good for our story too. That's why I'm just going to proclaim this today. Church itself, we actually think you have to know and understand everything before anything actually becomes a reality or do anything. You can't be confirmed. You can't be baptized. You can't come to the Lord's table unless you understand. No one understood anything in the story. No one understood. And yet the whole mode of Easter and the whole mode of the Church of Christ is that we have to understand something for it to really be true in our lives. And one of the reality is they didn't recognize Jesus. They didn't understand what was going on. They didn't believe it, but the resurrection was still true. It wasn't contingent upon whether they recognized him. The tomb was still empty. It wasn't contingent upon whether they understood. It wasn't even contingent on whether they believed that Jesus' words were true. The tomb was still empty. That's good news for you and me. And it's good news for what I'm doing up here too. Because I don't have to convince you to understand everything perfectly. I don't have to convince you to recognize everything. One thing I've learned over all of the years I've done Easter is hopefully every year I grow, and every year I come to this event, I can look back on last Easter and say, you know what, I don't recognize Jesus the way I recognize him now because he keeps speaking my name. You might not recognize him at all. You might doubt him at all. It's John's account. This is his account. We won everything last week. I think I saw last week. I think I saw her come in. So if she's here, and I think she is here. Last week, one of our congregants was coming to church. Lynn Selby. Lynn is here, right? Did I hug you or did I not? Lynn is not maybe here this morning. Lynn she's coming into church, and she's carrying a trash can. So as you bring your trash to church. So I began to think metaphorically to that. That's what we do. We bring our trash to church, not trash. Our church just needed a trash can. So that's why she was bringing it. But I began to think of that as what we do is we come here Easter and all nice and Eastery and all nice and shiny. We do that and we bring our trash to church. We bring our difficulties to church. And sometimes you could even think of that metaphorically as, we bring our trash cans to church to fill them up with whatever trash you brought into church or whatever. But I don't think that's what Jesus wants. In this event that no one recognizes, no one understands, no one is really believing till Jesus speaks a word. And when he speaks a word, there's life. So you come this morning, and I come. Some of you have buried children. Some of you have buried parents. Some of you and me are filled with anxiety. Anxiety just reigns in us. Some have come wondering where the next needle will come from. Some have come from the cancer diagnosis. And here's the story of Easter. Easter can only happen where death is. Otherwise, you don't have Easter. Easter only arrives where death is, because death is the only place that Easter is needed. And so when we bring our stories, we bring our things that are killing us, our anxieties, our relationships, all of those things. Mary does that. This is Mary Magdalene. And from what we know of Mary Magdalene, she lingers. She actually stays. Maybe there's a little bit of itsy-bitsy feeble faith there. I don't know. She doesn't seem to act like it. She thinks the gardener stole the body. But she lingers there. Maybe because she was just trying to refuse that the death of Jesus could be true. Her life had been a train wreck, and Jesus had entered into her life. But Mary's like us. Have you ever stood outside the grave of your hopes and dreams and wept? Have you ever stood outside the grave of all of your hopes and all of your dreams and wept? I would venture to say that most of us have, still do, and will again. And in the midst of that, it's Easter. For Mary, she didn't recognize Jesus. You may be here this morning. You may not believe anything I'm saying. That's okay. You may not recognize Jesus. But one thing this first Easter morning tells us is that our King, our Jesus, is so great, the greatest of all time, that this Easter and the resurrection was not about anybody's response in the story. It was about what God wanted and his love for you and for me and his pursuit of you and me. It was all about him. It was all about what he wanted to accomplish. And listen this morning. You may not believe this. You may not know what to do with it. You may not recognize it. But I'd ask you to be curious for just one moment as I end. Be curious about the fact that whether you recognize, believe, think this is silly or dumb, be curious about the fact that every story in this room, whether you're religious, irreligious, or whatever, every one of you wants something in your life resurrected. Every one of you. Everyone wants something in their story to be different. Everyone wants something in their home or their relationships or their lives. You want something to change. You want it. You want to rewrite your story. You want a do-over because everyone wants resurrection. Everyone wants it. Whether you believe in God or not, you want resurrection. You'll probably spend this week working on it. You're dying inside. And what I would like you to be curious about, and what I will actually proclaim to you, whether you believe in this Jesus or not, those tears that you have, those longings in your story that you want to be different, those cryings and those places that you're crying for Jesus, whether you recognize it or not. And I just love you to be curious about that. What is it that you want different? Christianity sets you free. Christianity should feel like our chains have fallen off, not like, oh, I hope I don't screw up. I've tried to apply that to Easter. Do you know whether I did a good job this morning or not? Whether I gave a sorry sermon or not? The tomb is still empty. It's empty. I can't screw that up, no matter what I do up here this morning. The tomb is still empty. That's why every Easter we're not here to offer you Nature Coast Church. We're here to offer you Jesus, period. And let him do what he is going to do. He's got me. He's got you. And he's got the one thing we need, the forgiveness of our sin. He is such the goat that the resurrection proves that nothing can stop God from forgiving you of your sin, even if we kill him. That's his love. That's his desire for you and your story and your life. I proclaim Jesus, the one who is risen. He's alive, and the tomb is empty. And religious or irreligious, it matters to your story. And he's come to set you free. I offer you Jesus. He's the resurrection and the life. He is risen. Risen indeed. We're going to stand and close in song. My longing and my prayer is that you would come awake. Come awake. That I would come awake. The graves I've dug myself. The graves I've placed myself in. Come awake. Come awake. Because the tomb is empty. I noticed as I was reading through old sermon this year, one of the ways I woke, I actually preached a sermon one time, this was in 2006, where I said this: Jesus did not rise from the dead so you could go home and have ham. Let me tell you with all joy that because he is risen from the dead, go celebrate. Go celebrate with your family. Go celebrate. And you know, if you don't have anyone to celebrate, find someone here. Someone will take you home. We'll take you home. You come see me. And you'll celebrate with us, and we'll have ham, and we'll have Easter eggs, and we will have the time of our life because the tomb is empty. Come awake, Pastor. Go in peace. He loves you. Amen.